We're now live. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon. We'll just wait for people to filter in. Sun's out in Melbourne. We take our small victories, don't we, at the moment?
We certainly do.
Us poor old Victorians.
Practicing lots of gratitude, we are.
We certainly are. Welcome everyone. We'll just give it a minute or so, and then we'll kick it off.
A few attendees coming in, which is great today to see. Awesome.
There is. Recognise a few Victorian faces there. We've got a couple from the US, which is great. Welcome. I think it's your evening over there, so thanks for making the time.
That's exciting.
That is. So we'll give it another 10 seconds, and we can kick it off in respect of everyone's time. Very good. Let's kick it off. So welcome everyone today to our webinar series. This is the second conversation in our series. Digital transformation isn't just about technology. And we're looking back, our first conversation was about 6 weeks ago. And before that, we actually started talking about the series about February, March. So how much has changed since then in 6 months? So we'll kick it off in terms of introducing our panel. Welcome Soren Reichelt and Janie Francis.
Hello.
It's Andrew. Hi everyone.
Andrew.
Soren, how are you, and what are you seeing out there at the moment?
I'm doing well, mate. I think I'm doing well living in this sort of lockdown world in Melbourne. Bit of screen fatigue every now and again, but look, I think for us at the moment it's about supporting clients and getting through this process. We'll get out of lockdown, but yeah, a lot of uncertainty I'm seeing out there at the moment.
Yeah, there is, isn't there? I hope hopefully today we'll be talking through plenty of real life examples to hopefully give some learnings and insight. So looking forward to that. And Janie, welcome. How's things for you?
Hi, Andrew. Hi, Soren. I'm really excited to be back in our conversation. And things for me are like they are for everyone else, I guess. Every day is a little different. And yeah, since we last got together, the landscape's really shifted under our feet while we're standing on it. And so some of the conversations I've been having with clients and with colleagues have also shifted, which is really interesting, from, how individuals deal with change differently and the implications of that, to, I think, a heightened sense now of the need to get to understand each other better, and to gain insights from each other in order to reignite some trust amongst teams who are very disparate. And that, that trust, I think, is really important for us to be robust enough and equipped to pivot or transform as we need to be. And it's of real interest to me, because a high trust culture is what we know makes us successful.
Love it. I love how you're touching on the basic human principles of trust, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go. So before we kick off into the detail, just wanted to touch on the format and the content of today. We don't often see these 3 words together, do we? In this phrase. Often, particularly cultures, is perhaps left out of this thing we refer to as digital transformation. And I want to refer to, there's a participant, Colin Fairweather, on today. We asked for questions beforehand, and Colin sent through a statement and a couple of questions really around what he's seeing in the market, and especially in the Victorian industry at the moment. And he highlighted a couple of examples, perhaps the difference from a digital perspective between the Victorian and the New South Wales governments in the contact tracing area, and also in the retail space, perhaps comparing organisations like Myer compared to someone like Accent, who are an online shoe retailer, and the very different approaches they've taken and the effect that's had. So thank you, Colin, for sending that in. And I think it really highlights a lot of the blind spots that perhaps organisations perhaps are missing. So that's actually going to form a key part of what we're talking about today. So Janie's going to be talking about the somewhat elephant in the room at times, this thing we call culture. Soren's going to be talking about technology as really as a core enabler of the business, and myself about strategy in terms of how it needs to be front and center. So Soren, I know you're seeing all sorts of things out there with your customers and their customers. Tell us a bit more about what you're hearing.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting time for businesses trying to, I guess, bring that perspective back to what are we trying to achieve as an organisation. There's been a lot of turbulence, and I guess those goals can really be about how do we sustain operations during this time? How do we connect with our staff? How do we make sure that people can do the work they need to do? But one of the things, and I love this slide because it really sort of starts to highlight and I guess uncover from our customers, what is that number one thing that you're still looking to achieve? I think through COVID, businesses have had to respond quite rapidly to the changing constraints, the new constraints that they're faced with. But it's always interesting to put into perspective of what those business goals are that we're looking to achieve given these new constraints that we have as well. So I think it's a great opportunity to ask the audience in terms of the priorities for your business. I know we've got varying industries and different roles and responsibilities on the webinar, but it'd be great, Andrew, to run a poll just to see from the people that we do have what their sorts of priorities are at the moment.
Good idea. So we've just launched that poll now. So for the participants, it'd be great if you could just have a quick look at those and select the one that is front of mind for you.
It's always interesting to think of this during this sort of really disruptive time, what those priorities could be for different organisations.
Certainly is.
And if they've changed from previously.
Yeah, last time we had a really interesting balance towards across all categories, but I think the angel metric will win again.
It looks like it at the moment, so I'm going to end the polling now and we'll share those results. And I think you're right, Soren.
Yep, the angel metric. So acquiring more customers in less time. And it's interesting to think, has that priority shifted since COVID, or is it the same priority you had prior to the pandemic as well? You know, if that's still the same goal, all that's really changed is our process to get there. And that's where I guess digital transformation comes into play, is how can we use these great technologies to really start to address and align ourselves to achieving those goals. So one thing that we do need to build some context around, though, is I guess the journey when we talk about transformation digitally. It's always important to put that frame together for everyone. What this really represents is the journey of technology that most businesses have been on. And it sort of starts at 92 when Australia first got the internet. Everything was really internal focused. So people were working in offices, were accessing that infrastructure in offices. And then as time rolled on, the technology got better. We could really start to work from anywhere. One of these inflection points, though, was the smartphone, which really then enabled us to work from any device. I think most of us work from our smartphone, but also connect with customers on those devices as well. And then the next real inflection point was that as a service, which was moving to subscriptionized technology. So rather than investing in assets, we're actually starting to access services, which enabled us to get that, I guess, lower that barrier to access the technology because we didn't need to invest in that asset. And then on top of that, what got built was obviously digital services that use those technologies and innovations, using the iPhone combined with the services to deliver new value and new products to the market. Uber's an example, Airbnb, all of those services that we use. And then finally, that digital enterprise, which really doesn't have any physical presence, I guess, across those different areas as well, and can be a truly virtualized service delivered out to customers. And Uber's a really good example of that. So it is a journey that every business has been on. But what's interesting as well is if you're a business that's been around for 10 to 15 years, or even 20 years, 30 years, where your business is at in this journey ultimately determines the level of transformation that needs to happen, because you've got legacy. Whereas some of these startups are now really starting to use these technologies and they don't carry that legacy through. So they're real digital natives in that process, and their business models really outpace what the existing market is doing. So transformation's needed in order to not only keep pace across those digital enterprises that are now entering these markets, it's also to start adapting and adopting with these technologies that have happened. And businesses have been really struggled by that. So let's look at why businesses struggle with that in our perspective and move into this slide. Now, I really like this one because it shows, I guess, at both ends of the scale. On one side, you've got management who's got its problems, needs and issues, challenges and ideas that are coming up in the organisation. Then on the other side, we've got the customer that interfaces with our business. And in the middle, we've got all the different bits and pieces from a technology stack perspective that really start to deliver value into both of those areas. But the traditional mechanism, and this is what we observe, the traditional mechanism for technology investment is really driven by management having all the ideas, passing that through to IT and technology getting deployed. And I think we really miss a trick there when we don't necessarily involve the business in that process. An example we use of that is a rollout of CRM. We want better forecasting numbers, roll out a new tool, we deploy the tool, but are the sales team using it and does it actually add any value to our customer at the end of the day? So we'll move on to the next slide, Andrew, and just look at that from a bit of a different perspective as well. Now, if we actually bring the customer into that equation, we really change that whole model for how technology investment is happening and how value can be driven on top of it. Andrew, you obviously work heavily in this space. Using the customer's voice to drive technology strategy, I think that's a really interesting perspective for a lot of IT teams that may traditionally have not ever been customer facing.
It is, Soren, and I know we've seen over the years, haven't we? Sort of backtrack, 10 years ago, some working with some technology organisations, and the mindset back then, and still some now, feel that the IT functions feel like they have to have all the ideas, they have to have the perfect solution before they roll it out. But as this picture paints, and you're suggesting that we're really flipping that, aren't we? We're saying, as opposed to saying we've got to have all the ideas internally, we start with the end customer. We look at the opportunities, the requests that filter through that, and that then begins to change the perspective of the internal view. So I think the more we can have that perspective happening, that then influences the internal decisions, the better. So for sure.
And well, what I love about this as well is it really simplifies a complex conversation about how to look at technology. I mean, technology is a platform and an investment that we build value on top of in context of the jobs that we're looking to do for either end of that scale, whether it be the business, so our internal team and how they're working efficiently, whether it be the interface that they have with the customer to actually deliver value in that process, or even for management to be able to drive and steer this business. Technology is seen as a platform and really capturing those opportunities in a repeatable way. I mean, it's a continuous improvement cycle, but can also be an innovation cycle as well if we're starting to bring those opportunities and suggestions and requests into frame as well. So, I mean, I love these sorts of images and how do we actually get there though, in terms of being able to use these types of things. And we've been working, guys, over the past few months together about that concept of the digital love wheel. Putting love at the center of digital is a really interesting perspective.
It makes people smile every time we see it, actually.
Yeah, it's just good fun. But looking at the idea of that platform, if we dive into this image a little further, so the platform itself is the technology the business is using, no matter what system it might be. It could be a CRM, it could be an ERP, it could be a product or an app that you've developed. But ultimately, the engagement of the client, the business and its data in that process is something that sits around that platform as well. Now, when you look at that platform, the direction that it's going in really needs to be driven by a strategy. And that strategy needs to be developed in order to provide the direction of where we're going with this platform. The other side to that is actually having the culture across not only the business, but also the customer that we're going to be transforming together. And there's some examples of that where some businesses will say, well, my audience is never on digital platforms. So the job can be very different for those types of businesses to actually connect this piece of innovation to that audience, right? Someone who's been used to receiving SMSs or faxes or whatever, understanding that there's an alignment culturally that needs to happen there is a big piece. Now, Andrew, you really look after, I guess, the strategy components at Foundstone. Using that combined with these technology platforms generates, I guess, that North Star that we talk about.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's how you've highlighted there in terms of the cultural element. Looking forward to Janie talking through some examples there. But you're right. So strategy can normally sit off to the side or sit over the top. And it sometimes misses a lot of the heart of what we're actually trying to do. And it misses what the customer is seeing out there. So definitely, I think the melding of the culture, the strategy, and then having technology as an enabler can be a huge advantage.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I watched this video the other day, and we mentioned this on our last webinar as well, but Satya Nadella and the work that he's been doing at Microsoft. Microsoft's a really interesting conversation because they're a technology platform provider. They have to obviously keep pace with all of these innovations in order to deliver value to their customer base, but also help their teams internally understand what that value is that they're taking to market. And I love this quote, though, that you just can't go to work and switch on the empathy button. And what this conversation was referring to was that approach of using empathy to really drive forward where these digital projects and innovation projects come from. Now, Janie, I know that when we combine empathy and digital, we always get a big smile from yourself.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to have a heart flutter when I see empathy float out into the sunlight like this and take centre stage. Yeah, I totally agree, Soren. And what really resonated me with what Satya Nadella was articulating is that the need for empathy to be consciously cultivated, and I would say consistently consciously cultivated as a part of culture. And I think that ability to feel and understand what other people are experiencing is 100% critical for us to go through transformation, and because I don't think we can successfully innovate it without it. And I know, Andrew, you're going to talk about that in terms of the external customer, and I'm going to echo that when I talk about how we need this empathy with our internal customer, the teams inside an organisation. And I think that companies now are understanding that qualities like empathy and inclusion and collaboration are essential to win the future.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Andrew, I mean, the point here is that empathy takes work, and organisations can't just switch that on. I mean, from Foundstone's perspective, the customer centricity components of what you bring in to that conversation really do start to establish that, I guess, North Star, using empathy at the core in terms of what we're building or why we're building before we start building, right?
They certainly do. And before I go on, I'll just highlight, if there is any questions as we go through, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to address them as we go through at the end. So happy to take any questions as we go along. So yeah, you're spot on, Soren. And as you and Janie have both talked about, empathy, it can be, I think Satya Nadella is a good example. You know, Microsoft 5 years ago was a very much, a tech-focused organization. When Satya Nadella came in, what I saw was he brought his real genuine empathy, even from his personal life and his family life. He brought that in, and he had that lens of how he looked at the world and the community. So I think that's spot on. And we see a lot of organizations perhaps fall into the trap of, starting with that inside looking out perspective. Again, thinking they have to have all the ideas, they have to have the perfect solution before they launch. But we're flipping that on its head in very plain language. So outside looking in. So what we're saying there is, as opposed to, the executive boards and management thinking they have to have those answers, we're bringing our customers into the conversation. And it might be uncomfortable to start with. When you're starting with those ambiguous conversations with customers and you don't have all the answers, it can be kind of uncomfortable. But we're suggesting that's actually the perfect place to start, especially in the environment we're in at the moment. As Colin mentioned, a question before, this macro environment, things have changed within 6 weeks, let alone 6 months. So this premise of this North Star, as you called out, Soren, is really essentially saying that by bringing your customers in and helping them to define what your North Star is, can completely change the game. As opposed to you saying, this is where we're heading, your customers then feel like they know they're genuinely part of the conversation and the discussion.
Absolutely.
And your customer then changes from that market base to more your community. So I think that can really change the dynamic. And as you can see the squiggly lines there, it's not a linear process. So sometimes it can feel like you're taking side steps, sometimes even taking back. But it's when you take the time to have that genuine conversation that you can see the results. And I know, Janie, when we're talking about conversations and making the time for that, I know you see a bit in this space.
Yeah, I can echo this in terms of culture, and this brings into play this idea here of an unhurried conversation, which we can have with our team and the members of the team who are going to be responsible for driving a strategy forward. And this is where we can kind of stop and take a step back, or as your diagram suggests, take a step sideways in order to look at, just to pause and look at what do we have here and now of value that we want to build on for the future.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of conversation.
Yeah, it's so true. And I know that, you know, you'll be talking about some of the cultural blind spots, and I think those conversations are perhaps one of them, aren't they?
Mm.
Before I move on, there's a customer we've been working with in the health and the education space, and they came to us. They had a strategy, it was a couple of years old, and they wanted to start with a very blank page approach. And what that allowed them to do, they were a bit hesitant at the start to go and talk to customers at the very start, because they thought, you know, we want to have empathy, but we don't want to look stupid in front of our customers. But we help guide them through and actually help to create a conversation, an environment where we simply help them ask their customers, what are you seeing? What are you hearing out there in the community? And by that, you know, they were then spending time with the people who were closest to the problem. And by doing that, all sorts of things, that blind spots that they'd never seen before started to bubble up, and then that was the center of their strategy. So I think that was just an example in the health sector where we saw about the power of those conversations. Which leads us to this concept, and some of you are probably thinking, what on earth has this got to do with strategy, culture, and technology? This concept of smartest person in the room mindset, or steering away from it. And how we relate it is, what we see is a lot of teams, whether it be a CEO, whether it be a board, or it could be a head of technology or head of people and culture. Perhaps the old school thinking is that, you know, I have to have the answers. You know, in a team conversation with internal customers, I have to have the answers, and with external customers, I have to have the answers. But we're seeing that shift happen, that it's really flipping on its head, and teams are wanting their leaders to say, hey, I might not have all the answers. So I know, Janie, you're seeing this within your world and within the culture space around the internal customers as well.
We work with this a lot, Andrew, and I love the way that you framed this here as the smartest person in the room mindset. And I have a client recently in the health sector. We were having this exact discussion and working through this and trying to unpack it. And, you know, I often wonder why leaders in particular feel that they have to carry the burden of being the one with all the answers. And I think it's because certain personality types are wired around being the solution provider, and, you know, their self-esteem is attached to, I'm the one that has the solution. And so what we're really talking about here is vulnerability. You know, being able to say, actually, I don't have the answers. And we know that's a really key leadership trait. And I think the other thing that gets in the way is what a lot of us practice all the time but are unconscious of it, which is called already always listening. So because of the filter or the unconscious biases that we have, we're, you know, we're placing a value judgment on decisions or on a person with a particular lens that we wear, and therefore you know, we're impeding ourselves, we're blocking ourselves from being open to some other opportunities, so we can miss a lot of opportunities.
It's so true. It's a subtle shift, isn't it? But that subtle shift of actually listening with a blank page as opposed to those preconceived ideas can totally...
Yeah, I think we just have to be aware that that's what we're doing. Yeah,
big time. And a customer comes to mind. They're a mid-sized organisation. They operate in the water sector and the agricultural sector. And some of their board perhaps had the old school mentality and they were putting pressure on themselves that we have to have the answers ourselves. How on earth do we go and speak to our customers about this? But we slowly provided a few examples and slowly had some of them, you know, put those biases aside, as you talk about, Janie, and actually listen with the intent of actually hearing what their internal customers are saying, but also their external. And it totally changed their perception of their customers and what they were seeing. Mm-hmm. This next one, just before we go through this, this is a customer we work with over the last couple of years, and a lot of this was around human-centered design principles. So I want to just go to another quick poll just to gauge people's experience and their how familiar they are with human-centered design. I'm just going to launch that poll, and if you can have a crack at just one of those four, whether you've never heard of it, or you're completely familiar and you're using it day to day. And it's always interesting. We've seen human-centered design perhaps more used in just a pure text space, but we're seeing that change coming into the cultural elements and coming into the business strategy stuff and making some significant change. So I'll end that polling now, share those results. So it's coming up, yeah, quite familiar, have considered is probably the majority, and then leaning towards familiar and using it. So it sounds like that a lot of people on the call are pretty familiar, which is great. So I'll talk about it in terms of that, in that context. This is an organisation, another customer within the health sector. This customer has about 40,000 odd members, and they provide services to general practitioners, to specialist nurses, and to patient advocates across Australia. They came to us. They thought they'd defined a problem that was pretty high up the priority list. They wanted to solve around two pretty significant issues: mental health and obesity in the community. So fairly significant, and they wanted to really verify whether this problem was accurate, and then how they were going to solve it. So we helped them actually bring in their end customers and their partners. And as you can see in these couple of these pictures here, bringing in, having an actual conversation, starting with the blank page approach, as opposed to the biases of what the problem they thought it was. And we used things like, customer journey maps, empathy maps, which are pretty common within human-centered design. And fast forward after a couple of weeks of those conversations, we've really found and uncovered that there was actually a very different problem than they thought originally. So they could have started basing solutions on that original problem, but they ended up saving themselves literally millions worth of dollars of resources and technology costs by looking at a system approach. Technology was a part of it, but technology wasn't just the only thing. And the problem they ended up solving actually was the key one within the sector. So I think that's just a bit of an example of how human-centered design can be pretty powerful. So this is just a picture in terms of more of the how around human-centered design. I was reminded of a quote fairly recently by a colleague. It's been around a while. I hadn't heard it for a while. Albert Einstein, if he was asked how long, if he was going to save the world, how long he'd spend if he had an hour, he said he'd spend 59 minutes on defining the problem and then 1 minute on the solution. So I think it's a picture to me of how even a bloke like that solved so many global problems, he immersed himself with people out in the world, and he was willing to sit in that ambiguity. I know it's sometimes pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people. It's been uncomfortable for me in my experience of not having the answers. And I know, Janie, I've heard you talk about the unknowns. There's the unknowns are the most pressing ones. It's those problems that we're not even aware that exist. Mm. And until we sit with our customers, our community, in those unknowns, they don't bubble up. And I know, Soren, from a technology point of view, with your customers, you spend a fair bit of time actually defining the problem before you look at going forward with a solution.
Oh, 100%. I mean, for me, one of the things that I guess technology only has promise in the outcome or value in the outcome that it generates. And the more input that we can get into that process by both customers and even internal teams, an example, again, I used an example of rolling out the CRM earlier, making sure that we're bringing people on that journey, whether it be the internal customer or the external customer, to generate value in that process and work together to build. Ultimately, the outcome that you get is greater adoption or more value from that investment. And I mean, the terms that they use is like MVP or minimum viable product, which is basically the first release of something that we're going to do that has some level of value. And, sometimes we're retrofitting, we're going back or retrospectively looking at what's been built and needing to realign it or rejig it to what the organization or the customer needs. But these sorts of processes and frameworks just add significant value to guiding that process. They don't define it, but they guide that process through to make sure that those, I guess, key points are hit. when the release happens.
Yeah, I think it's a classic, and I think it's worth you spending a bit of time. You know, even defining minimal viable product is quite familiar in the technology world, isn't it? But for a lot of other industries, they're still getting to grips that minimal viable product is the starting point before you then roll it out into a bigger thing.
The first release, yeah.
That's right. So, and what we're seeing in terms of this, I mean, co-creation can be a bit of a buzz term. What that really means to us, as you just pointed out, Soren, is that it's really involving your customers in the process. And what we're actually seeing is when organizations do that, they're actually developing relationships at the same time. They're actually growing their business and relationships at the same time, as opposed to waiting for the perfect solution. So I think that sums it up nicely. So before I hand over to you, Janie, strategy roadmaps. Now, there's all sorts of frameworks and methodologies out there. You know, some good, some bad. I guess when we break strategy down to first principles for us, strategy comes down to choices. It's the choices, that the things that we're going to do, and as importantly, the things that we're going to stop doing. And I think in times like this, again, referring to Colin's comment around things are changing so quickly, that we have to be keeping a pretty close eye on our blind spots and the choices we're going to make to stop doing things that are really going to make a difference. We see perhaps some organisations perhaps starting just to tweak the status quo, and in our view, and I know Soren and Janie, you see similar things. We see that's not really enough in this stage just to be tweaking the status quo. You've really got to look at bigger shifts to really meet the macro environment. And where we start from a strategy point of view is the current state. And when we look at current state, it is really getting organisations really honest about where they're at. It's putting the egos, the politics, the silos aside, and being really brutally honest to say we might be well off the market. What do we have to? Where are we now? Where do we have to be? And I know, Janie, from a cultural point of view, often current state is looked at from a technology or a strategy, but sometimes we miss it from a cultural perspective. That's what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of synergy here, Andrew, from what you're talking about as the current state being a starting point when you're building a strategic roadmap, to the current state being the starting point for when you're redefining and reshaping your culture. And I'm going to talk soon about performing cultural audits, and the very place we start is current state. So by that I mean taking an audit of the behaviours you're observing. So who do I have on my team? How do they interact? How different are they? How similar are they? You know, how are ideas formed and shared? How are decisions made? And what do we actually have here behaviourally that we want to take into our desired state? So that's exactly the first port of call in redefining your culture.
Yeah, big time. And I know you're going to be talking through some actual customer examples, so looking forward to that. So before we move on, Mike, I see you've noted there minimal, lovable products, and I think that sums it up nicely as well. That it is your customers and they've got to have an emotional connection to it. There's so many apps and platforms out there these days. I think we've got to take a step back and look at what's really happening below the surface at a human emotion, and once we can genuinely tap into that, can make a difference. We've been working with another customer in the education space and helping them with their strategy. They partner with the likes of Victoria Police, magistrates courts, so pretty formal, pretty hierarchy-based organisations. And we literally started the conversations with their partners, so some pretty senior people within those organisations. And it's been good actually, Zoom-wise. The uniforms are taken off, in their t-shirt, having a cup of tea in the lounge room. So it's actually worked kind of well. And what we've seen is they've, simply asking them, what are they seeing and hearing in their community? They've been so open about, helping solve and define a problem. And it changed the dynamic then from that partner relationship to them coming up with problem statements and ideas that they then were a part of. So that shifted the whole dynamic from that customer partner. So I see that's pretty powerful. So we've talked a lot about technology, we've talked a bit about strategy, but Janie, I'm sure you'd agree that all those are pretty useless if we don't have our people on board. Would I be right in saying that?
That's right, Andrew, and that's why I'm going to eat you for breakfast, because I'm
Yeah.
the scary one here out of the three of us. This is not a new concept by any means, but I think it's really highlighted now, and culture is under the spotlight as opposed to just strategy and technology, because I think we have to add in now. We can all see that we have to add in the human layer to achieve our big reset, if that's the path that we're on, because after all, culture influences two major factors, that's behaviours and actions, and that's exactly how strategy is lived out. So to me in my work, that means culture is the great enabler of successful pivoting or transformation. So I should probably explain what I'm referring to when I talk about culture, because it's obviously not just having a purpose, embedding purpose and values and having meetings about that. It's actually about who has a voice, who gets to be heard, how do we make decisions, and what sort of conversation, what sort of conversations do we have? And so what we're talking about is behaviours, and then what symbols and systems do we put in place to support those behaviours when we do see them and when we don't. So I think that if we're not deliberately shaping our culture, we're really exposing our organisation to an enormous amount of risk, because we know that it's the biggest driver of success from what we can see. My clients say to me, well, okay, we recognise that we need to do something with our culture, but how do we go about doing that? And that's a three-stage approach, just to simplify it. So the first stage is obviously the observation stage, about who we've got on our team and how they fit together. The second stage then is to define the sort of culture that we want. So we might say, well, in order to achieve our objectives, we need a meritocracy where we're just going to reward results, or we need a true team culture where there's no such thing as an individual result, only collective team wins. Or we might say we want an innovation culture where it's okay to fail in some cases because we learn from it. We knowing the unknown. And so because it comes down to human factors and individual behaviours, here is a demonstration of the blind spots that we've been talking about that can actually impede or derail, as I like to say, successful implementation of any strategy or any business pivot. If we don't have if we haven't put the spotlight or focused on individual behaviours, and we haven't determined what we need, these are some of the kind of inhibitors that we can find. So quite frequently we see silos. So that's, different departments with their own agendas and then blaming each other when something falls through the cracks because they're not on the same page. I think we're all pretty familiar with that. If the culture hasn't been a focus and the humans haven't been put together in a way, we haven't got the right people in the right roles, etc., and we're not aligned to where we're all going, we can often have a low recognition of staff, so people feeling that they're being ignored, or, a lot of my clients, I hear people say, oh, it doesn't matter what I think, because they don't have a voice. That's a cultural issue. That often then leads to some micromanagement, which of course is the antithesis of what we need to motivate a team. And of course, disengaged staff. Often we see a lot of presenteeism, and I think that's being exacerbated now that teams are very dispersed. We see people turning up virtually, of course. They're not really engaged, but they're clocking on, clocking off, and they're doing the bare minimum. So they're not being productive. An exaggerated form of that is poor performance. And then worst case scenario, of course, is a high turnover, and a whole lot of amazing IP leaves the organisation, and then the cost of replacing that person is quite devastating. So all of these lead to an inability to innovate. So now that I've just pointed out all of these potential derailers and blind spots, it's probably a really good time to ask those who are listening, what would prevent you then from focusing on redefining your culture? So let's have a look at a poll.
So I've just launched that there. four choices: knowledge, leadership, time, or the elephant, the big one, politics. So you can define that one however way you want to.
Whoa.
We've still got people coming in with a bit of knowledge, leadership. Okay. Time. So I had a client quite recently who said, well, we know we need to work on our culture, but when I proposed this to the senior management team, they said, oh, but we're already really busy. We don't have time for another project, a culture project, not fully understanding that culture is the way that they are being busy and the way that they're operating. So
47% there, Janie, on leadership, and then followed by time.
Yeah. And this could go back, Andrew, to your concept that a lot of leaders feel they have to be the smartest person in the room, so we don't have to focus on everyone else's individual behaviours. So I guess, Andrew, this is most closely related to what you must see with your customers. Do you see some of these derailers, the fallout from not having a focus on individuals and their behaviours?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the point you touched on there, the silos and blame game, if we be honest, I think from what I've seen over the years and still see now, the different functions, so the technology function, marketing function, people and culture function, and then snapping up to the CEO and board, there's often that big divide in understanding different worlds. So the CIO is sitting there saying, I don't really understand the bigger picture strategy. And then the CEO and the board could be saying, well, I don't really understand how technology can enable this. And then people and culture perhaps too often sit off to the side that aren't really directly involved in the day-to-day conversations of the business. So I think for me, silos and the blame game, and then management would have to be the two biggest that we're seeing out there.
Yeah, and I could just link back to when you talked about co-creation. Often the reason we have the silos is because there hasn't been a co-creation internally with the internal customer about the strategy. So there's not an engagement. There's no ownership of it because it wasn't co-created with the team.
Yes. So true.
So from what I've just illustrated there, because culture is such a powerful influence on the motivations of people, and we are talking about individuals, I would argue that culture actually drives the value chain. So therefore, when you do have a really fulfilled, motivated and cohesive team who are actually going to drive some transformation, they're going to be really productive. They're all on the same, they're all driving in the same direction, and they're going to feel fulfilled and satisfied, which translates into them going the extra mile for the customer, for the project. And that, of course, obviously delivers customer satisfaction and loyalty, as we know. And the spin-off of that, we all know very well, is, profitability, growth, and in some cases, survival. Some cases like we're in now, survival. So that's the relevance of the individuals being motivated. And I'm going to now share an example, an illustration with you, a live example where this didn't play out. So culture was not a focus. Individuals' motivations was not taken into account on a major transformational project. This was a FMCG company based in Sydney in the beverage industry. This diagram, which I'm going to demystify for you, represents a leadership team of 14. The CEO was her personality type, which we profiled, was she was very strategic and an innovative thinker, and she was also very goal-driven. So she was what we call very dynamic. She loved great ideas and just wanted to put them into execution, into drive mode. So what we're looking at here is a neuroscience psychometric tool, one of many that I use. It's based on 4 quadrants of the brain. So just really briefly, what we're looking at here is the right brain hemisphere, left brain hemisphere, upper and lower, giving us the 4 quadrants. And what this map is telling us, this was the culture piece of work we did with this team to understand why it derailed. how we could address that. What we're doing here is measuring the degree of preference each of these 14 individuals had in these different parts of the brain. So then we collated that to see how the team behaved and how this played out collectively. So what we're looking at, if you look at the orange quadrant there and the pink one, 100% of this team fell into this coordinating default mode, which means they were extremely consensus-based. So they really just couldn't make decisions unless they had 100% consensus all the time. And they also were high evaluators. You can see 86% of them. So it just didn't feel safe for them to be operating in a fast-paced environment and to be acting very quickly and to jumping on board something that was out of their comfort zone. And so a lot of trust was broken and communication was poor. And, they weren't really engaged in the strategy. So that's where it sort of went off piste. And to summarise this, and the next slide might be a little easier, when we summarised the team, what we actually had was a group of people responsible for a massive transformation piece who sat on what I call the discerning axes. So extremely high evaluators and extremely consensus-based. So didn't like risk, couldn't make decisions quickly and couldn't act. So this is a classic example of what happens when we have a very well thought through strategy, a very clever digital solution for growth, and a team that wasn't aligned.
And it's really interesting, isn't it, Janie, when you think of that perspective, and even yourself, Andrew, of designing out the culture. If we are looking to establish some innovation in the business, or we are investing a significant amount of money into a digital program or a transformation piece of work that we're looking to do, I think this is where businesses miss the trick, is to actually look at the team itself, and is that team architected for success? Because if you're asking a team, as we were just saying there, Janie, in this sort of discerning access to do something that they're not really comfortable doing, or maybe they believe they're comfortable doing but not very good at doing, just by the very virtue of how they're put together, then that team itself is set up to fail, and therefore the risk with the investment is much higher in that approach. And I love this perspective, because no one that I've seen before has really brought that cultural element together inside transformation to say, this is a way of avoiding those, blind spots and issues that happen in these transformational projects.
And Soren, I think you hit the nail on the head there, where you said this team actually believed they were embracing this innovative platform, but it's subjective. So somebody who, in this particular case, so many of them were so highly evaluative and analytical that their view of being innovative was not really being innovative. They were just, they were optimizing, not being truly innovative. So.
It's absolutely.
I think it's we see it in our daily lives, don't we? In terms of making the time just to stop and actually be aware of what other humans and personalities we have around us. And just surround teams and ourselves with people that aren't just echo chambers as well. They're people that bring new and different perspectives. So I think that sums it up.
Yeah, that was a textbook case of paralysis by analysis. Yeah.
There you go. Classic.
Yep.
Classic. So we've just hit the 45-minute mark. So thank you everyone for attending. And just before we wrap up, I wanted to hand to Soren and Janie in terms of getting your main themes from today. Soren, what was your main kind of takeouts?
I think my main piece of advice for people as they're going through very turbulent times and transitioning business models is to really look at that current state from a cultural perspective. We've been working with Janie for some time now and actually seeing how that plays out and how it helps teams really start to align to that transformational piece before they start developing that, strategy and technology roadmap. That would be my key takeaway.
Nice.
Well, I'm going to echo that. So
of course, I stole your thunder, Janie, but I'm always very impressed by your work.
We're always on the same page, the three of us. But I think we can't achieve the great reset, as I love that term, unless we reset with ourselves and we reset with each other. So, my takeaway is that I keep using the metaphor of the spotlight, but I think it's time to, really shine on put the light on looking for cues of other people and trying to understand how they're going to approach things and make decisions, because that's the key to cohesiveness.
Beautiful. And for me, I think the empathy conversation, Soren, you know, starting with Sachin Nadella, I think we don't often hear that in digital world, do we? And then Mike from the audience extended minimal, lovable product. And we've got to love, whether it be strategy and the people we work with and the products we're working with, we've got to love them. So I think that sums it up, then, that for me from today, that we've got to have our heart and soul on it and be aware of the macro changes as well. So thank you again, everyone. Really
Awesome.
time. If there's any questions, reach out to any of us, and we'll be in contact to get your feedback.
Thanks, guys.
Guys,
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Cheers.
have a great Friday.